kills my duck, so I ruin his life. So, here is my story. Back in May of 1990, there was an unseasonably late snowstorm. A few days after it snowed, I was riding my bike, and found a baby duckling all by itself near a river. There was no mother duck around, so I put it inside my shirt to keep it warm and brought it home on my bike. My mother thought it would die because it was so small and cold and wet and shivering, but I put it under a light, and after a while it dried off and started hopping around and peeping. It was so cute, it followed me like a puppy. I called it Philip, because it sounded like it was saying Philip, Philip, Philip whenever it peeped. So, after a few weeks, I figured I ought to teach it to swim and eat stuff in the lakes, so I started bringing it to a small local beach. Philip did well, he swam around and ate zazas and snails and everyone at the beach loved him. Now my trouble started. After I had brought Philip to the beach several times, the lifeguard told me that his boss, the director of Parks and Recreation, who will be known as Stuffed Shirt, had told him that there was a city ordinance against bringing pets to city parks. I tried to explain to the lifeguard that it was only for a few weeks, and then the duck would be grown up and able to live on its own, but he didn't care. I was upset. How was I going to teach the duck to live on its own? I went to the library and got out the large blue books of city ordinances and looked up the relative ordinance, and discovered something interesting. There was one ordinance that prohibited bringing dogs into city parks, and another that prohibited bringing horses into city parks, both of which I see happening fairly often, BTW. But no ordinance against bringing ducks into city parks. So, I went home and called Stuffed Shirt. However, it being a weekend, he wasn't in, so his secretary answered the phone. I told her what had happened and what the ordinances actually said, and told her to tell Stuffed Shirt that I would be bringing my duck to the beach anytime I felt like it. Well, apparently when Stuffed Shirt heard this, his head exploded. He called me back and told me that he had had a conference with the city attorney about my duck, and according to him, the city attorney had decided that the law should be interpreted to refer to all domestic or pet animals, not merely dogs or horses. Then he said he had called the DNR, because I was not supposed to have a duck. Now, please note the following at this point: attorneys are not privileged to interpret the law, only judges are supposed to do that, and the law was not ambiguous such that it required interpretation. One specifically said dogs, the other specifically said horses. Note that at this point, my duck was referred to as a domestic animal. Anyway, a few days later the DNR agent shows up at my house, and marches right into my backyard, without ringing the doorbell, and without a warrant. We will call him Butt Buddy, because I suspect that was his relation to Stuffed Shirt, as he wasn't even from my city. Stuffed Shirt had gotten him to come over from another city. I was in my backyard at the time feeding Philip, my duck, and Butt Buddy proceeds to read me the riot act. First he tells me that my duck was a wood duck, which is a wild animal, after Stuffed Shirt had previously referred to it as a domestic animal. And this was a lie, BTW. I learned later my duck was a mallard, which can be considered either wild or domestic, depending on the circumstances. Then he tells me that I can't have a wood duck, which my duck wasn't, without a game farm license, and that I couldn't get a game farm license unless I had 40 acres of land. He then told me that I either had to let my duck go by the end of the day, or he would confiscate it and take it to a lake in another town, where I would never see it again. I told him my duck was too little to let go, and I was going to let it go in a month, but he wouldn't hear it. He told me I had to do as I told him. I was crying as I let my poor little duckling Philip go on the lake. I went back that evening to check on him, and he was cowering, terrified, under a boardwalk. The next day, I couldn't find him at all. He probably got eaten by something because he was way too little to let go. Then, would you believe, the next week, Butt Buddy the game warden came back onto my property, without permission, again, to make sure the duck was not still there. Now, on to the revenge part. After losing my duck, I went to the library and spent hours looking up the laws about wildlife and game farms, and I found out something very interesting. Butt Buddy the game warden had lied to me. As it turned out, you only needed 40 acres of land to get a game farm license on land where hunting, trapping, or killing of animals was going on. Otherwise there was no land requirement to get a game farm license, only a pen size requirement, which my pen for my duckling more than met. If I was devastated and crying my eyes out before, now I was so furious that my head was exploding. They killed my duck not because it was the law, but just for an ego trip. So I got even. I was the town eccentric, so I didn't have any reputation to lose, and didn't care what people thought of me. I spent the next several weeks walking around downtown and telling everyone who would stop and listen about my duck, and how Stuffed Shirt and Butt Buddy had lied to me and made me condemn my own pet to death. Maybe people thought I was nuts, but I didn't care. Everyone was finding out what happened, and Stuffed Shirt was scared. I had a friend from work who also worked part-time in his office, and she told me he was so frightened that he had gone to a lawyer to try to pursue a slander charge against me, to get to stop telling people what had happened. Only the lawyer told him there was absolutely nothing that could be done, because truth was an absolute defense against slander. And if he didn't like the truth, whose fault was that? Stuffed Shirt's critical mistake, of course, was actually filing a complaint with the DNR so that he could get Butt Buddy game warden to legitimately intimidate me into releasing my baby duckling way too soon. The DNR, like all government agencies, keeps records. If he tried to claim I was lying and slandering him, there was documented proof of what had happened. So the outcome? Stuffed Shirt lost his cushy city bureaucrat job as the director of Parks and Recreation, and the last I heard of him, about 10 years after this happened, had lost 2 other jobs, his house, he couldn't make the payments when he had no job, his wife, who didn't want to stick around when he had no job, and was somewhere in a trailer park, drinking himself to death. I hope he did, too.